Welcome to The General and the Journalist, our podcast from the Times and the Sunday Times about how the old order is shifting, conflicts on the rise, and the way that wars are fought is changing right before our eyes. Tom, you're the journalist part of the equation, Tom Newton-Dunn.
And you're the General, Patrick, General Sir Patrick Sanders. And how are you this morning, Patrick?
I'm pretty good, Tom. I'm in London at Times headquarters in London Bridge. You, on the other hand, are somewhere else. Where are you, Tom?
I'm further afield. I'm in New York City, actually, this week. So hello to you from the Big Bagel. And I have to tell you, it's even hotter than London here, 35 degrees centigrade. And we're going to try and record this podcast from 3 different locations, which is going to be fun, because in a moment we're going to be joined by a very special guest from Washington, D.C., a few hundred miles south of where I am. And that's because the huge new digital revolution that we're now in the middle of, the rise of robots and the rapid development of AI, is also having an extraordinary transformational effect on warfare as well.
Yes, we're living through a period of rapid and often unsettling military transformation. We're seeing everything from unmanned ground vehicles, 3D printed autonomous drones, right the way through to hypersonic missiles. And the AI revolution, potentially in the future paired with quantum computing, is redefining what's possible on the battlefield and at breakneck speed. So the wars ahead will look nothing like the ones we've known, and yet paradoxically, Tom, some of what we're seeing also looks terrifyingly like the Somme and World War I. And of course, in Ukraine, that's where much of it is already happening. And Ukraine's ingenuity, inventiveness, was summed up perhaps most powerfully by Operation Spider's Web last month. We've talked about that. When
Absolutely.
Ukraine brilliantly destroyed dozens of Russian heavy bombers all over its vast territory with an attack of, I think it was 117 remotely piloted drones, launched from remotely functioning ISO containers. It's almost like a form of aircraft carrier of the future, but infinitely cheaper.
So how on earth do today's armies, navies and air forces, because this is very much a tri-service problem, keep up with that light-speed technological change that you've just been describing, Patrick, and prepare themselves to fight the wars of the future? Well, it is an enormous challenge. For the US Army, that challenge falls to our guest today, General James E. Rainey, who leads a team of over 17,000 personnel worldwide as head of Army Futures Command. And we're going to talk to him about just that. What will the wars of tomorrow look like?
So welcome, Jim. It's great to see you again, and thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule to join us.
Oh, thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Tom. Great to be here.
So, Jim, just a little bit about you before we get into Army Futures Command. I mean, you joined, like me, we're both infantrymen. 35 years later, you become a general. What was the journey? What took you to here? Why have you found yourself in this role?
I, like a lot of people, grew up, every person that I respected in my life had served. My coaches, my youth pastor, the neighbor that everybody respected, best couple teachers I had. So, I just thought that was something I wanted to check out. I joined the Army, went to college, got a scholarship, and, about 19 years old, I decided I'd join the Army for a few years, and, here we are. I've honestly never spent a single minute of a single day thinking about getting out of the Army. I love it. Waking up in the morning with a sense of purpose, going to bed at night with a clean conscience. And, like everybody, I've moved through a series of assignments, had the privilege of commanding, which makes you want to command again, as you know, Patrick, for the right reasons. It's just so awesome. Here we are.
General Rainey, I'm really pleased you say you wake up with a clean conscience every morning. I'd love to say all us journalists do precisely the same thing, but this is not a podcast about the future of journalism, luckily, so we don't have to go into that. General Rainey, do you mind if I refer to Jim? Simply because there's a second general
please.
in this conversation. It might confuse listeners, so I excuse awfully the appalling ignorance of rank from now onwards.
No, that's fine.
You've made it all the way to 4-star general, which is no mean thing in the US Army. And your current job, I suspect, may be the most difficult yet, but let's get into all that. The Army Futures Command was actually only set up in 2018, so it's a relatively new beast. So perhaps you could tell us why someone thought of the idea to do it.
Yeah. there's a lot there. The last President Trump administration, the senior leadership of the Army decided to carve out a separate four-star headquarters to focus entirely on then modernizing, now transforming the Army. And like a lot of things, if you had the opportunity to start something more recently, the Army, our military, everything we have has been around a long time, and it's hard to, do big changes with historic, organizations. So they had an opportunity, and they did some really smart things. They decided, did a nationwide search and decided to place the headquarters in downtown Austin, Texas. Um, and it could have been a couple other great tech centered cities, but the nexus of not just tech, but university system, two of our biggest university systems in the country are right down there. And I'm not on a big Army installation, so you don't have to get through security to come visit Army Futures Command. So put it there, very small, 90% military civilians, Department of the Army civilians. So 90%, so STEM, PhD, engineer, heavy on the civilian side, and then the 10% military are all um, competent and accomplished warfighters, infantry, armor, artillery, our best aviators. So it's a really exciting team to lead.
Your 17,000 staff, I have to tell you, that feels like an awful lot. And the MOD in Britain would be hugely envious of that. They have almost certainly far smaller team. It's a sign that the US Army obviously takes the future of warfare incredibly seriously.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that. I would describe my headquarters as very small and lean. I have a 300-person four-star headquarters. The 17,000, they're not all staff, obviously. We run all the centers and research laboratories. I have subordinate organizations. A three-star Future Concept Command is one of my subordinates. All the medical research is done by a two-star commander who works for us. And like I said, all the lab research is under another two-star commander. So, but yeah, by our standards in the Army, 17,000. I mean, the division I had the privilege of command, the Great Third Infantry Division, is bigger if you're counting just humans. But there's lots of reasons when you apportion, leadership, as you know, Patrick. It's not just the size. In the case of Army Futures Command or transformation, it's the complexity of the problem that argues for the number of people. And like I said, the Department of the Army, the civilians we have, about 10,000 of those 17,000 people are what I would call credentialed science, technology engineers, PhDs, advanced degrees. So very, very talented workforce.
It certainly suggests to us that someone in the Pentagon, the White House, is pretty determined to get this right.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have to. The sense of urgency by which we are, holding ourselves accountable is unprecedented for a lot of reasons. Our chief, General George, and our secretary, Secretary Driscoll, are at the risk acceptance max possible speed that I personally have not ever seen in my time in the Army, because we have to, and it's not 2040, 2035. Those are important, and we can talk about that if you want. But the standard is the next time we go to war, that we absolutely have to change things, or young men and women are gonna pay the price for our inability to rapidly get what we know we have to get to those soldiers, before we go to war again.
Jim, I remember when Army Modernization Command was set up back in 2018, and locating it as you described really well down in Austin, along the sort of tech bros, felt like a really radical step. It was as if you were breaking the mold. We also know that big institutions, and you are a big institution, are not great at handling change or changing themselves, particularly during peacetime when you don't have that imperative of that the Ukrainians, for example, are facing at the moment. How would you mark your scorecard over the last 3 years? And do you think that you can drive this change? And is Army Futures Command the right instrument to do it? Because it's hard, isn't it?
Yeah, well, change is hard. Change in a bureaucracy is hard. Um, yeah, well, I'm never satisfied. I would never say, okay, I feel really good about where we're at. Like I said, the sense of urgency, you know, by which we need to transform. It's frustrating every day. I mean, the the fact that there's technology that we absolutely know we need next time we go to war, indisputably. There's a lot of things that are maybes, but there's some indisputable counter UAS, electronic warfare. We got to get more and better UAVs at echelon. I mean, for example, um, uh, so yeah, I'm not satisfied with the pace of that, and it's really frustrating because the technology exists. You know what I mean? Like it's not like we got to go out and invent some program of record, make a new tank, make a new helicopter. This is literally about buying things that exist, and the only metric I measure our organization by is capability in the hands of warfighters. So reducing timelines, getting more money, fixing a process. Yeah, I'm all for that, but the metric is no kidding capability in the hands of warfighters. So I'm never going to be happy. I've never sat down and graded myself. I mean, I want to be better tomorrow than we are today. I want to go faster. If things were flying through the acquisition process, I would still be trying to squeeze another day out of it. But there are some things that are I'm pretty proud and excited about. For example, we spent a couple years revamping our entire approach to command and control. We had our command and control system was a mess, too complicated, too stovepipe, didn't work, too expensive. So the chief, made that his number one priority and asked Army, asked us to get after it. And in a little bit over 2 years, we went from a clean sheet to no kidding industry teammates on contract, validated through 2 project convergence. And we are it's going to revolutionize warfare. Because the ability to move to truly data-centric warfare is what's going to unlock all the potential of whatever the hell happens with AI and quantum maybe. But if you don't own your data, it doesn't matter. So that is a thing that I would say 5 years from now we'll look back on and people will realize what a revolution that was. So there's big wins, but never enough. Nothing's good enough for a rifle squad, in my opinion.
Jim, I'm really struck by your sense of urgency. You said that several times. I'm frustrated. We need you to go quicker. I want to do this faster. Why?
Let me try and personalize this. The videos, I don't know what your viewers watch, but a TikTok video of a of a Russian soldier being hunted down and killed and trying to surrender to a UAV. Helplessness. That horrifies me as a professional. And the idea that a U.S. Army soldier would ever find themselves in a position of helplessness, I can't even imagine that. We don't expect our guys to be, we expect our soldiers to win outnumbered, win outgunned. We expect our tanks to kill 10 tanks. I mean, that's a good day. That's an expectation. So, but we never would accept a U.S. Army soldier not having the inherent right to defend themselves, not have a fighting chance. And I think there are some things that if we don't get into our soldiers at scale before we go to war again, we could potentially find ourselves in that position.
You feel that really powerfully. It's obvious.
Yeah.
So, Jim, that I guess takes us to thinking then about how warfare is changing. So, when you think about the future of warfare and the target that you're aiming for, as clearly and succinctly and simply as you can, because we'll have non-expert viewers and listeners to this podcast. Can you describe how you think warfare is changing and also why?
Let me start with a couple things. So, and you can cut me off if this answer is too long. Okay, so first of all, being intellectually humble and passionately curious. Those are the 2 skills that I would encourage anybody who's in this space to make sure they have. And I say that because anybody who thinks they have it figured out, like when somebody tells me or writes that they've figured it out, I'm like, okay, so the goal is not to figure it out; it's to think about it, pay attention to it, monitor it, be agile as you're going through it, because the future is unknowable, to state the obvious, right? So the goal is not really. I tell people the goal is not to get it right. The goal is to not get it really wrong, and then see what you got wrong and be able to adapt from that faster than the person you're fighting. So, uh, you got to be humble, you got to be curious, you got to try and figure out, things you can bet on. So that's one. Number two is I always encourage people to start with what's not changing because that is knowable. Control for the known. So war remains a human endeavor. I've seen nothing in Gaza, Ukraine, Russia that would make me change from what we all know. Going back, pick your favorite dead theorist. War is a contest of will between human beings. That has not changed. Number two is the land remains decisive. Okay. Yeah, I'm not saying it's the only decisive. Stay out of the joint stuff, but the indisputably, as long as those humans continue to insist on living in the land's going to be decisive. So those are two things that I would anchor on. The third one I would say is indisputably true, but some people would maybe challenge it. But close combat's not going away. So in any vision of the future, men and women are going to have to cover that last 500 meters in the dark, in the dirt, in the rain, when it's cold, when nothing's going right. And unfortunately, they are going to have to kill their enemies, at close range, 100 meters, 10 meters, with their hands, with a shovel, with a bayonet. Tanks are going to have to be able to destroy massive enemy armored formations when everything's going wrong. They're outnumbered. So those three things, it's not good. People, land, and the ability to win a close fight are three things that we absolutely can't walk away from in our quest to figure out the future. And then to get to your question, sorry about that. So bottom line, that said, holy shit, you know what I mean? The amount of disruption at scale and speed is like crazy. It's unprecedented, clearly. Pre-World War II, somebody invented combustion engines, airplanes, and radios. That's pretty disruptive. But even then, it was like a race to figure it out. And then once you figured it out, you're good, right? Now you're trying to figure out stuff, and you got about 2 to 6 weeks before something else happens. So it's like this perpetual state of disruption that is unprecedented, which makes figuring out the future much more complicated. So the lenses that I use, for what it's worth, that I've found helpful, is look at something and ask yourself, is this revolutionary? I mean, is this like the real deal? Going to fundamentally change the way we fight, or the nature of warfare? Is it an evolution, which is something you got to figure out? It's like, okay, this is going to change the way we do what we do. And you got to figure those out. And then the third category that I'm not certain that enough people are paying attention to is it just an anomaly? Would a NATO, U.S. UK joint force with all of our tools, the way we fight, would we have to deal with that, or is that something that is anomalous to two armies that cannot maneuver, fighting a war of tradition? You're watching attrition warfare with an exhaustion strategy. I'm not, so you got to look at which of the three, then you can start actually trying to figure it out.
Jim, how on earth do you tell the difference between the three?
I'm blessed, like the UK, our armies are professions. These aren't jobs. We don't work at the army. We are the army. And as a member of a profession, one of the highest responsibilities you have is to be competent, and you have to think about it, and you have to talk about it. And having the intestinal fortitude to throw your ideas out there, and lose an argument with a 28-year-old, you know? I mean, it's going to happen. That's where that humility and curiosity comes. So I don't know. I mean, to me, I think deliberately, is there a revolution happening? I think there's two potential, data-centric warfare and the combined effect of autonomous unmanned systems. I think the unmanned system thing is as big as when people invented tanks, at least. And the data-centric warfare is, unprecedented.
Jim, just define data-centric warfare in one sentence.
So the ability to move every piece of information you have into a usable and accessible state of being in a data layer unlocks the potential to bring AI to bear, because you can't bring a large language model to bear unless you have data. And in the Army, every military I know has stovepipe mission command systems that move from a piece of information has to go from a sensor to somebody to decide to a shooter. And most of the time, they don't have access to real time sustainment. And no matter how good you get at connecting that kill chain, it'll never be fast enough for China. All right. But taking all that information and moving it to a consolidated data layer that every sensor feeds and every shooter has access to, and you're able to bring the potential, whatever's going to happen, to bear, is I think revolutionary. I was way more than one sentence, but it's really complicated.
Thank you.
Jim, so let's just talk a little bit about data-centric warfare, since you've described it really clearly. I mean, so I get why you're doing it. It's you'd be crazy not to. You'd be left behind if you weren't dominant in this area. But of course, you and I both worry about some of the risks in this. And you talked earlier on about the danger of not being so far off the mark, to use Michael Howard's language, that you can't adapt swiftly enough. You can be decisively wrong. And the three things that always worry me about data-centric warfare is, first of all, interoperability. So you can create a perfect information bubble within the US Army or across all of US defense. But what do you do with allies if you're going to fight alongside allies? So there's the data sharing problem.
Yeah.
The second is the Chinese themselves, of course, have developed this doctrine of intelligentized warfare, where they're trying to achieve the same thing, but they're also designing themselves precisely to disrupt and dismantle the very data networks that you're describing. So you could be setting yourself up for a fall. And then sooner or later, this stuff doesn't work. You and I have both been there. At the end of the day, sometimes you're left with a paper map and a pencil. So what's the reversionary node when an EMP denies the whole of the network? There is no easy answer to it. It's not a reason not to do it. But how do you think about that problem?
That's actually three wicked problems. I mean, we would say. So yeah, the data sharing, we've already solved that, Patrick. And I'll tell you, one thing that I was encouraged when we started this a couple years ago is, unlike most of our problems where we wish we had more money, the amount of money we were spending on stuff that didn't work is actually sufficient to pay for the things that do work. It's fascinating. But so example, 5 years ago, me and you trying to coordinate, we got 3 server stacks, 100 soldiers running back and forth, trying to make stuff work. Now, once you establish that data layer that I described, it's a QR code and you turned a hardware problem into a software problem. So at Project Convergence 5, my tank's there, you're a dismounted UK rifle company, you come up, we can touch phones, you can scan a QR code. My guys can give you access to whatever amount of my network I want to share with you. It's solved. It's I'm telling you that's why when I say potentially revolutionary. Now your second point.
Huge step, and that's a huge step from when I so when I went on Convergence, 3 years ago, 2 years ago was the last one. I mean, that's a big step on since then.
Yeah, and it's because of that. Like I said, turning hardware problems into software problems, which, hey, guess what? We have a huge advantage when it comes to software. So why not take advantage of it? The Chinese, they are what they are. It's the threat that we're focused on. We're not taking them lightly. They do have a lot of capability, deep magazines. Depending on where you fight them, potentially interior lines, and certainly mass. So we got to be better, and we got to out decide them. Our commanders, so back to my people, is an advantage. So let's put the commanders back in command and control. Let's make more, better, faster decisions. And I think we can. I think we can get a 10x overmatch in that space. Personally, the good news is though, if it doesn't work, that plays to our strength and is a huge limiter on them. My theory. I don't personally know any Chinese commanders. I have not fought them. I study them to the extent possible. But the fact that the U.S. Army, and my experience with the U.K. Army also, is we're an intent-based formation. So our soldiers, in the absence of orders, our leaders are going to make decisions, and they're going to make good decisions. That's a superpower. So you come to a fork in the road. If you're your Chinese commanders telling you're going to be paralyzed waiting to be told whether to go left or right. US UK commander's going to come to that fork in the road. There may be monitor telling them telling them facts about both sides, but it's enabling commander decision making, vice making decisions for commanders. So I think that plays to our strengths. I think we got an advantage. And then the last thing is, yeah, Patrick, the pay, we call it PACE, primary, alternate, contingency, emergency. Like this one thing I'm certain of is it's not going to work all the time. In my experience in combat, the time that the bad thing happens is usually the worst time. Like your stuff never breaks while you're getting ready to LD. It always manages to break when you're trying to cross the river, or you get your first company of pairs on the ground, then stuff breaks. So the responsibility to be able to go, old school whistles, tracer rounds, that stuff is still relevant. And to your point, Patrick, you got to train it. You got to train degraded, disrupted. You got to be ready for the horror of war.
Jim, let's just talk about Ukraine for a moment, because Ukraine is the crucible of all this change. It's happening in real time and incredibly fast, so much so that we can barely all of us keep up, us chronicling you as a military commander. There are two areas we'd love to talk about individually maybe. One is, of course, autonomous vehicles, drones. The other one is detection, sensors, how the battlefield is now all known. On autonomous vehicles, just how much has the Ukraine war changed warfare as we know it? If you go back to, say, January 2021 to now.
Yeah, unprecedented disruption. I would put it. It's either a revolution. If it's not, it's like at the very, very top of the evolutionary change to the history of warfare, and it really started 20 years ago or so when we saw the first UAVs coming on, and it disrupted the air domain and the intel aspects of the military. 10 years ago commercially, 5 years ago military, you started to see that marine disruption in the maritime. And what's happened in the last couple of years is in the what I refer to as the air ground littoral, the first couple thousand, maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000 feet off the ground, which is always, ground commanders have always dealt with airspace. I mean, that's not new. What's different is it's not about deconfliction and coordination. Now you actually have to fight in that space as much as you have to fight on the ground.
Drones have been around for ages. You're right. I mean, you've been shooting
yeah, but then it goes
in Pakistan for a long time.
I don't want to make light of it. Yeah, I don't want to make light of it, but then it's like hyper speed over the last couple of years, and it's a lot of factors. It's technology, the speed of technology. It's the horror of this war. I mean, this is just horrific. Like Patrick, you mentioned World War One. I'm like, except for World War One, they like ground each other off, figured out it was stupid, kind of paused, and everybody reinvented their tactics. You no longer have that ability, and then the willingness to sacrifice human life is just appalling to me, and the absence of law of armed conflict, those kind of things. So there's the necessity. I mean, it's an existential struggle for both countries, certainly Ukraine. There's very few things that I would say are definitely not changeable, but the laws of physics are one. So the thing that kept the disruption from the ground domain was their autonomy didn't catch up with the laws of physics on the ground. It's easier in the air. It's easier. It's not simple in maritime domain, but it's easier than on land. So what I think we're seeing is that first 2,000 feet, and what we're seeing with UAVs right now is just the leading edge of what I believe is going to be a gigantic disruption of the ground domain once autonomous unmanned systems, ground systems, which we're starting to see the beginning of. Go back in the 2 years, what you were seeing with UAVs is happening with ground robotics right now.
Mm.
And I think it's going to go fast. The art is going to be figuring out how do you optimize humans and machines to come up with the best, most lethal combination of that. Offload risk onto machines, optimize your humans for the things that only humans can do.
So there's an interesting parallel, isn't there, with self-driving vehicles, with autonomous vehicles, and I think there are 5 steps of autonomy when we think about self-driving cars, where the bottom step one is sort of basic dumb cars, and step 5 is totally autonomous vehicles. The interesting step is between sort of step 2, which is where you have humans augmented by automation, and then step 3, where you've got autonomous systems, machines augmented by humans. It's quite a big shift.
Yeah.
And there are some ethical dimensions in that as well. How far do you think we are from seeing that third stage, where rather than autonomous systems simply augmenting humans, it's the other way around?
I don't view it as that transactional. I think it's going to be more fluid, where you're going to have X amount of unmanned systems, X amount of humans, and how you bring them together in what combination for what purpose. To your earlier point, I wouldn't want to be halfway through an operation that was 90% autonomous when the network goes down. You know what I mean? So now, if I was trying to cross a minefield, I would also want 0 humans involved in that endeavor. You know what I mean? So how do you transfer risk to machines in the right way at the right time? But I think your question was more technical with autonomy, and I'm not an expert. You got to go after a bunch of different lines of effort, I think, and there's a couple. So one is, how do I use unmanned systems to increase the survivability and lethality of formations? So how am I going to put, I don't want to put an active protective system on 14 tanks. I want to put 4 robots with active protection around my 14 tanks. The second one is, like every army, we have a bunch of stuff in the army. And so aftermarket retrofit is fascinating to me. In the US, there are a bunch of companies that you can say, here's how I'm doing what I'm doing, here's how many trucks I got, here's what they do. And I'm really excited about low cost aftermarket retrofit, where you take what used to be 10 fuel trucks and 30 or 40 soldiers turns into 2 manned vehicles. And then the third one is thinking big. Is there a new way to do anti-access aerial denial? Is there a new way to do layered protection that's almost entirely autonomous? So I think you got to pursue all 3. And like I said, I'm not big into predicting the future as much as just paying attention and figuring out how to apply it.
There's been another prediction with reference to completely autonomous drones, stage 5 autonomy for aerial drones, I think, as the drone makers call it. In other words, drones working together, swarm drones, taking off independently, going out to hunt for targets independently, finding them, killing them, and coming back. Incredibly independent operation. How far away from that?
I don't know. I wouldn't be comfortable, putting a mark on the wall for that. I would say sooner than we think. What's really interesting to a military professional is what I refer to as mission autonomy. So, how can I use a combination of unmanned systems to accomplish an actual mission? Go do a reconnaissance of this area, go destroy the enemy's, radars. That's a little bit further off, I think. And again, it's so vulnerable to electronic warfare, jamming. So part of the problem is you can't go, put yourself in isolation for a year, solve the problem, come back and put it into the battlefield, because the battlefield's changing so fast. So that's what's so impressive with the Ukrainians, in my opinion, is their ability to learn in, period of darkness and we're paying really close attention to that.
A final question, autonomy, then we must move on. The moral component, the ethical
Yeah,
component in
yeah,
this, that is what I think a lot of people might be starting to worry about. A bit like
yeah. They
driverless
should
cars
be.
driving around cities. Do you need a human in the chain of command at all times so that you don't end up with these sort of killer swarm drones going off and doing their own thing and committing to the sort of things that we as human beings would have deep ethical problems with?
I cannot understate how important it is that we're talking about professions. Um, our country, our leaders, our civilian control of the military, we are extended a lot of authority based on the fact that we're a profession, that we're trustworthy, that we're competent, that we're accountable, that we police our own ranks. So I would not be comfortable alleviating that. There's also a thing called the law of armed conflict, which the U.S. Army is not going to walk, we're not going to walk away from that. We're a values based military. In fact, I tell people we don't need to be a little bit better. We got to be 10 times better so we'll have the time to apply the law of armed conflict. And it's something that anybody that's going to be commanding a military formation in the U.S. has been educated, trained, and practiced at great detail. So ethical decision making: can I do it? Should I do it? I do not see that coming out of whatever we decide to do with lethal autonomy. Now, our enemies, absolutely. So that's the challenge, Bad actors are going to do bad actor things. So our people who are working on countering that have to be dramatically better.
We've talked about what's changing in warfare and why, and you've been really clear about that. I guess the real question is, what are you doing about it? And how do you see the adaptation, the transformation that needs to happen to the U.S. Army? And I sort of thinking back, the most successful forms of transformation have arisen out of concepts. So historically, we could think of how Germany in World War II came up with a concept called blitzkrieg. It was devastatingly effective for a while. The U.S. Army arguably came up with one of the most effective warfighting concepts in history with air-land battle. And of course, that drove your doctrine, it drove your tactics, it drove all of the equipment you procured, all the stuff that you're fighting with today, the Apaches, the Abrams, the M109s, MLRS, and so on. What is the concept for warfighting, the warfighting system, if you like, that's driving how you think about how you organize yourselves? And then our second question, if you can just bear with me, is, and what does that mean in terms of your organization? Because your army and my army look remarkably similar to what a Roman centurion would have recognized, or indeed Napoleon would have recognized. We still group ourselves in squads, in groups of 10, 100, 500, 1,000. Does that change?
When you're transforming, you got really two problems. You got to go left to right, sense of urgency, crazy disruption. Next time we go to war, we owe our men and women the absolute ability to dominate the land domain, be lethal, and survive. But you also kind of go out a little bit further. I'm pointing out to the right here. You got to go out this way at some knowable period of time, figure out what might be changing, what's probably going to change, what might, and have a concept for that. So in that environment, what are we going to have to be able to do? And of that stuff, what can't we do now? So we spend a lot of time what we call the future operating environment, studying not just our enemies, but also technology, demographics, figuring out getting an estimate of what that future is going to look like. Then what kind of skills are we going to need, capabilities in our Army? And of those, what can we do now and what can't we do? We experiment rigorously, at great cost. I mean, we put giant formations, no kidding, in the dirt out at the National Training Center, work with partners and allies. So we've done that. We're close to putting out a new concept, I think, but I will give you some examples. So thinking about command and control, data-centric warfare, more, better, faster decisions, that is changing. That's going to fundamentally change. Next gen command and control, Patrick, we're out of the headquarters business. You're not going to see command posts that are unsurvivable. Commanders are going to fight on tablets and phones. up to brigade level, you probably wouldn't be able to find the headquarters.
Put some colour on that, Jim, because you and I know how big and static headquarters used to be. Just give the listener
Yeah.
a sense of how radical a change that is and how hard it is.
Yeah. So for a brigade, 50, 100 vehicles, tents, server stacks, generators, um, totally unsurvivable. I mean, you would probably have trouble getting soldiers to actually do that in real combat, but you would be it would be professional malpractice on the future battlefield as a good enemy to try and establish a command post when ubiquitous sensing, you know, just the electromagnetic signature those things put off are just too easy to find. And now with precision UAVs, the enemy can hit anything he can find. So we are going back to fighting, out of turret. I say turrets and tablets. Our infantry guys are going to be fighting off tablets, and everybody else is going to be fighting out of their turret. And that presents a huge advantage because that's really, really, really hard. And if you don't have a talented, well-trained, well-led professional force, you couldn't even attempt that. And we figured out how to do it. And really, our commanders are so good. The younger, the better. The digital natives, versus the digital immigrants, they pick this stuff up in 6 weeks of training. So C2 and counter C2,
That's
cross
command and
domain
control.
fires. Yeah, command and
Sorry,
control. I'm sorry.
yeah.
Cross domain fires, Patrick. So what's interesting is the Army land forces have always had ways to fire into the land. We've had some nascent air defense capabilities. Now we have the ability from the land to fire into any other domain. We can attack space. We can attack cyber. We can shoot maritime targets with land-based missiles, moving maritime targets. So the potential of thinking, still dominating the land domain, but how do we provide the joint commander Army capabilities to strike into all of the domains? That's evolutionary, in my opinion.
If that's what you're doing, what we should be doing, what about others? What about the potential enemies? Because I'm struck by there is still a technological advantage. The US and some NATO countries, Israel has a technological advantage, perhaps over China and Russia at the moment. That gap is closing. But on the battleground itself, on the battlefield, Russia is light years ahead of us because of what they're doing in Ukraine in terms of how they're fighting infantry engagements with their drone warfare. How far ahead of us is Russian tactics, Russian equipment to actually engage and close with the enemy right now?
A well-trained, well-led U.S. or NATO, U.S. and partner, U.S. and NATO formation, I would not concede that the Russian army is better than that. Okay, they're ahead of us on UAVs right now. We're closing that gap. And we have way better technology, way better AI. Their electronic warfare is impressive and startling, but we're adapting to that. That's a knowable problem. So I would challenge you and say, show me somebody that's maneuvering over there. I mean, the Russians, they couldn't maneuver when they invaded. They got stuck. Their stuff broke. They couldn't do combined arms maneuver. They built their whole army around battalion commanders being able to maneuver, and they couldn't. And here we are. They're in a static position. They're grinding off. They're literally doing human wave. Just feeding their people. That's not infantry. They may be walking, but they're not infantry. Infantry don't. We don't do that. We move combined arms, fire and movement. You're also not, I mean, I would not describe what you're seeing as joint warfare. I mean, where's the Air Force? Where's cyber? Where's space? There's a little bit of that, but a total joint, because that's how we fight in the U.S.
All right. No, and related to that, how worried are you that China is now going to catch up with the U.S. in terms of the high tech, AI, for example? They are developing exponentially.
I'd bet on America. I mean, I think the sense of urgency, the understanding, the look at top 50 software companies and how many are in the U.S. Look at data centers, look at supercomputers, look at universities. Capitalism matters. Venture people are betting on tech defense. Now, we could fumble that. It would be a mistake to pat ourselves on the back or rest on our laurels. I think it's going to be a race akin to the space race, nuclear race. We have to press. But I think I believe we have and will maintain an advantage when it comes to all things AI.
Jim, final question. You've talked really powerfully all the way through this about the importance of human capital and the professionalism of our warfighters in the US Army and with our allies, and the ethical backbone that underpins that. Just, I guess, two questions. First of all, in the past, you've talked powerfully about the need to inculcate, to train the habit of adaptability as a skill. First question: how do you go about that? And then secondly, do you see there being a role for technology in actually augmenting humans, whether that is through use of, I don't know, chips embedded or physical augmentation, or indeed a form of bioengineered augmentation?
On the second one, I don't know and hope not, but I'm not an expert. I'd have to defer to people that understand that a lot better than I do. I think technology, are you going to replace your decision makers with technology, or are you going to use technology to augment your decision makers? Well, I believe the latter. Aiding our commanders' decision making with technology is the path we're on, and I think that's the right path. The adaptability thing, yeah. So I think one of, if not, next to lethality, probably the biggest characteristic of a future army you want is adaptability, and it's really hard. How do you make adaptive humans is hard. How do you make an adaptive formation? And then, Patrick, you ran your entire army. The ability to make an adaptive institution is, so these are gigantic problems, but we're working hard on it. When I talk about adaptability, just to unpack it a little bit, to me, it's kind of the combination of two things. Can you practice adoption? Because that is the tech problem. So the ability to see something happening, see a solution, rapidly adopt it, and get it into the hands of warfighters. That is a critical adaptability on the material side, and it applies to some doctrine, lessons learned things too. And then the other one is innovation. Can I create something new that's of value, that's worth the cost? Can you do those? That's Jim Rainey. There's probably a better definition somewhere, but it's not just make new stuff. Make new stuff that's of value, that's worth the cost of that value, and you have to be very deliberate in your approach to that and pursue all three of those criteria before you say you're innovating. But if we can do those two things at the individual unit, leader, institutional level, which I believe we can, we will maintain a marked advantage going forward.
Jim, thank you so much for coming on. I have to tell you, if ever I thought it was important to get the future of warfare right, you have utterly persuaded us now. You've been incredibly eloquent on just how important it is to get this right with things changing so incredibly quickly. So, General James Rainey, thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Patrick. Good to see you again. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, Jim, and give my best to the Chief.
Well, that is about it for today. A big thank you to our guest again, General James E. Rainey, the head of the US Army's Futures Command. We'll be back next week, but in the meantime, do get in touch with any questions you might have, or just to tell us your thoughts. Email us at generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. That's generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Patrick.